Hi, I'm Mike.
And I'm Aaron.
And you're listening to Thought Fuzz,
The only podcast hosted by Mike and Aaron, where we debate the big ideas behind the big issues you're debating today.
This week, we're discussing...
Should there be limits on political speech?
So, speaking of sore throats, this is going to be my most labored topic transition maybe ever. But after watching Donald Trump's State of the Union address, or address, is it address or address? State of the Union address, because an address is where you live,
yeah, that's correct.
So that I may address you. Right. I don't know the etymology of address.
It's proper English, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, should there be limits on how a leader communicates?
That is indeed our topic for today.
Right. And we came to this topic after all the controversy around the way Donald Trump communicates, the way that he speaks, what he says to people, the fights he picks, his choice of words. It's been something that people have fixated on pretty much since 2015 when he announced his candidacy, and since 2016 when he won the election, 2017 when he became president of the United States. So how should a leader communicate? That's what we feel is maybe the most pressing question in this topic. Once you understand that Donald Trump is not exactly presidential, he might be modern day presidential, but once you understand that he's not presidential, how should a leader communicate?
Well, or if he's not presidential, what principally makes him
so unpresidential?
So how we're going to do this podcast is I'm going to present an argument that I've had a number of times over with a bunch of my friends and relatives and whatnot, and after which I've remained fairly alone in my position. And then Mike's going to counter it, and I'll see if I can't convince him that I am in fact, or that I do in fact have a great idea. So I believe that, first of all, if you're paying attention, the nature of Donald Trump's speech is or has been as harmful and galvanizing, and has contributed as much to the polarization and to the what's the word for the intransigence of America's political system.
Okay.
As has the content of his speech.
Right.
And I'm forced to contrast the nature of American political discourse with what is commonly, with what is common in my own country's political discourse.
Okay.
And
nobody's forcing you, but sure.
Well, I'm forced as a thinking person to contrast it. Now, of course, and I also follow British politics as well, because I think it's both British and Canadian politics sort of fit together as sort of two sides of the same coin. They are, of course, both parliamentary democracies. So as Donald Trump has, since he's announced, I've been contrasting his discourse with that of our own, and the principal difference that I see with his discourse and ours is that at least our official political discourse is controlled by some measure of censorship. And it is this measure of censorship that I believe helps funnel the political process towards what it ought to aim and away from what it ought to avoid. Okay. And it's this kind of censorship which I think America should submit itself to legislatively and enforce this kind of this discourse in its political class. And I'll even go so far as to say that I think that this kind of political discourse ought to be enforced legally, in principle, for all political figures, for all public figures, whether or not they're actually speaking in Parliament for the terms of their office and while they're speaking as themselves.
Right.
So that's my grand thesis. I can already see you humming and hawing. So the devil's in the details.
Right. Okay.
So
let's just break this down here, because I think any time that you start talking about leaders being censored,
that's right.
Political
sounds crazy, no?
Political figures being told what they can and cannot say. You're liable to piss a couple of people off.
Oh, no doubt.
And raise questions about the nature of free speech and political discourse. So, how... I know you probably have some way of rectifying these competing claims. How do you do it?
Well, the most natural objection, I think, to the concept of censorship in political discourse is the most natural objection also to the concept of censorship simply as it's on its own, which is, doesn't that limit my free speech?
Yeah, doesn't it?
Well, the first thing to say about that is there is a common myth in our culture, and it's actually, this myth permeates people at even the highest levels, or rather even the most obscure levels of our society. But even in academics, both high and low, student, professor,
right?
As it does in politics and as it does everywhere else in the working world.
Get on with it.
There's an idea.
Okay.
That free speech means
radical, say whatever the hell I want.
Radical free speech.
Right. Okay.
And that there's no such thing as a distinction between.
And so what you're going to say
speech
is
and
that
radical free speech.
You're going to say we have constraints on this. Like, I can't run into a movie theater and yell fire if no fire is there.
Correct. And it is the case. It is the case that we've never had in Western countries. We've never had legally enforced radical free speech. Now, for various and sundry reasons, we've never had that. But principally, we do not have radical free speech because our freedom to speak ends when our speech begins to loosely said hurt others. So we're free to express ideas to a limited degree, to a certain degree, but we're not free to publicly publicly galvanize people for the death of a group of people based on their ethnicity, their confession, their gender.
I think
we're not free to slander other people, to libel other people, and there's all sorts of reasonable constraints on our free speech that people don't people forget about. So the first point is that there's no such thing as radical free speech. That's point number one.
That's point number one. Okay, and I think most people pretty much understand that point.
Well, I don't think so. I think that's
so let's jump to point two.
But in any case, I think that's a fairly self-explanatory state of affairs, right? Point number two is that it seems as if there's a difference between a public individual and a private individual.
I don't see the difference, but go on.
If for no other reason that a public figure, a public servant, by virtue of the nature of their office, has a guaranteed right to speak and a much expanded audience to that of any typical private person.
Okay.
And this audience and guarantee of speech is according to them by virtue of their political office, right? So it's different. It's different when a private person, say, walks like what happened to me the other day, walks on a subway platform and starts using racial slurs.
Okay.
It's different, I contend, when a private person does that than if an elected representative of the people were to do that.
Yeah, but is that different because they're essentially different, or is that different because of their visibility?
Well,
because of their position and power.
The intuition I'm trying to elicit from you here is that there's a there is or ought to be a greater responsibility incumbent upon public figures to care for the content of their speech, the nature of their speech.
Okay.
You put these two things together.
Right.
It seems fairly intuitive to me that elected officials in our country, and I would say in America as well, they have a moral responsibility to express their ideas without violating the basic concepts of free speech laws: libel, slander, racism,
sure,
all these things. And now, yeah. Okay. So that's my first point there, right? That's my first blow. Okay, I think that this should be
okay. All right.
This should be fairly intuitive to people. Now, if politicians do not voluntarily comport themselves that way, I maintain it ought to be enforced legislatively.
Now this is where I'm going to start to disagree with you. Now, so we all understand that politicians should really be representing our best selves, right? Politicians should, especially elected ones, have, if not a mandated, a mandate to speak well and to speak respectfully and to carry themselves with certain dignity. If that's not mandated by rules, at least in principle and informally, they ought to do so, right? We all, I think, basically agree with this.
Right.
Right. Some people don't. Some people do like that wild cowboy kind of leader because they think that it can get a point across, and I think that is a respectable and understandable viewpoint.
I think it's understandable. I don't think it's valid in any way, but I'll say more about that later.
Okay. So what you're suggesting then is that we take it one step further and actually put a law in place stating what elected officials can or cannot say, or the way in which they can or cannot say it. Because let's just say one thing right now, is that you're not talking about whether or not they can use Twitter or something like that to speak. No, you're talking about the actual content of their speech.
No.
You're talking about the means by which it's delivered. Is that correct?
The means by which. Because, of course, you might say, Aaron, how is that possible to live in a free society when you're actually censoring the content of the public servants?
Well, okay, now it's not as much of a straw man as you're making it out to be, because the way that somebody speaks about a topic may be the content of their speech.
So I want to take...
Right? I mean, words aren't just, float. They don't just float without meaning. The words oftentimes are embedded with such meaning that they will determine what you mean to say, even if you try to massage it.
Well, so I want to use as our example here.
Okay.
This isn't the strongest example. This is the most egregious example, but this is the example that galvanized me to think about this. And this is Trump's first speech when he called Mexicans rapists and murderers. When he said Mexico is sending its people, or when Mexico's sending its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending criminals, they're rapists, and some I assume are good people.
Yeah.
So this absolutely flabbergasted and enraged me, and started me thinking about this. So how would I apply this principle, right? I would not apply it to the content of a politician's speech. That's too far, because no matter how crazy, as an elected representative, you ought to have the right to express in a rational way and as well reasoned and constructed as you can any idea that you have, and then it is, of course, once the idea is presented, it is the job of the political class and the voters of the country to assess it and to punish you or reward you for your idea, to agree with you, disagree with you, etc. So I'm not talking about censoring content. What I am talking about is having rhetorical laws, censoring methods of delivering content. Because Trump could have said that in a rationed, reasonable way. Would it have been, would it have been ridiculous? I think I would say so. But what he could have said is, we've taken a look at the nature of the immigration statistics and whatnot, and we believe that the Mexican government is conspiring to weight the level of the nature of its immigration to us, of its illegal immigration, towards the lowest denizens of its society,
all right,
and et cetera, et cetera. You see? So what does this mean?
Okay.
This doesn't mean that horrendous ideas like that can't be expressed, but what it does mean is it removes the principal barrier to addressing the nature of those arguments. And that principal barrier is the rhetoric. America's media has not yet moved past his rhetoric as a general whole.
Well, okay,
but they spend most of the time, and people.
Okay,
and
hold on, Aaron. You're making a huge assumption about that. You're assuming that rhetoric and meaning are separate. But as I was stating before, the rhetoric may be the meaning, right?
Okay, you're right. So I have to give another example.
Right. So
I have to qualify it more.
So when
all right.
just to underscore this point here, or underline it, I should say. If his point is that the people coming from another country are utterly undesirable to the extent that they are a net detriment to the community or the nation or what have you, okay? If he can express that specifically, that is the idea. And if you tell him he can't say it like that, in effect, you're telling him that there are ideas that he can't say, right? So to really push this point further, let me put it to you like this. The reason why, one of the biggest problems that I have with this argument so far is that you're making a delineation between politician and voter, or say elected member and the person electing them, that I don't necessarily see, right? An elected member could be previously, somebody in the population, the voting population, who just happened to reach that position, okay? So until that point, they were beholden to the same speech laws as anyone else. And when they do reach that elected position, they're still somebody who can vote. They're still a member of the voting population, even if they have that position. Therefore, ought to be still subject to the laws and ideas, or to the governing principles that we would hold anyone else to. Now, obviously, they can't just spout out classified information or something like that, or tweet out the nuke codes to North Korea. Okay, but that doesn't mean
$10 says he does it.
He's not going to do it. I'm not going to make that bet because I don't know. I don't know.
How messed up is that? Do you see what just happened there? How messed up is that?
He's not going to tweet the nuke codes, but he might
fall asleep on the desk and come, Anyway.
Yeah,
okay, all right.
Okay, but hold on, right? It goes deeper than this. Your freedom of speech presumably includes also the political ideas that you espouse, and you can enact those political ideas or express them through your vote. It's why you can take a voting card and not vote for anybody and just write on it, "Go screw yourself" or something like that, and hand it into the voting box, right? The way that you vote is the expression of your political ideas. And putting that person in Parliament or Congress or the Senate or wherever is an expression of that. So if your ideas are as nauseous and awful as Donald Trump's were when he announced his candidacy for president, nonetheless, that is an expression of an idea that is otherwise not treasonous, not,
In this case, perhaps it isn't.
In this case.
But just to follow your argument to its conclusion, do you believe then that all expressions are are equally valid and ought equally
I didn't say
to have
equally.
a
I didn't say
platform.
equally valid.
Are all expressions are ought to be able to be expressed as easily as any other. One expression has every right to be said as much as any other.
That depends on how the alternative would be, right? If you say that,
what does that mean?
So if you're saying that all ideas deserve to be equally expressible, okay?
Yeah.
The implication in
Well,
that
I'm not
statement.
saying that. You're saying that.
No, hold on. You just asked that question, so own it.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so the implication there is that there is another way in which ideas are not equally expressible, right? Presumably. So if there is a way in which ideas are not equally expressible, the question then becomes, is that legislated or enforced by law, or is it enforced culturally, shall we say, or in terms of morality, a publicly understood social contract saying, I will not go out into the streets supporting the Nazi party or something like that. Now, what I would say is that legislation ought not to be in place banning you from, say, supporting a party in Canada.
Remember, I'm advocating for rhetorical censorship, not content censorship. Okay.
But that's a distinction you still have to clarify.
I will.
Which
I will.
And not just clarify, but by that I mean back to the point I was saying before about the rhetoric being the content.
Okay, maybe we should stick with that for a second. Okay, so I do have an example in mind.
Now, hold on. Just to finish my point.
Sure.
It may well be that a violent communist party runs for parliament, okay, demanding that we kill the kulaks and seize the means of production, turn Canada and set up gulags and things like that, okay? Like, I mean, like, as bloody as the October Revolution ever went, this party is demanding that, okay? I would argue that they have a right to say that, but voters should have a social contract that they would not accept it of parties.
What you're talking about is content. I'm not talking about content.
I'm not convinced that you aren't.
So
I am not convinced that you aren't. So why don't you right now lay out,
all right,
basically, in reply to what I've been saying, that content and rhetoric are not necessarily separate.
That's right. Okay, so I do have an example in mind.
And can be the same thing.
And I also have an example, it's a rather comical one, but I think it demonstrates the point enough. I have an example of a purposeful breaking of this contract. So the idea that I have with this is to take the enforced speech constraints of formal parliament and expand them to constrain all politicians whenever they're speaking in an official capacity.
Can you repeat that?
So this idea I have is to take the already in place formal constraints on speech, on rhetoric, the way in which we express ideas,
right?
That's in Parliament, and expand them to hold to apply to all politicians whenever they speak in an official capacity. Okay. Now, as I've just expressed, Parliament is my example. So the parliaments of Canada and Britain, they operate when they formally sit. There's what's called a speaker in the House, and the speaker's job. The speaker has many roles. One of his roles is to control the back and forth of the House to make sure that what the House's purpose, its principal function, is able to occur. That being debate. Okay. That being the conflict of ideas. Okay. And parliaments have identified that one of the principal barriers to an effective clash and battle of ideas is offensive rhetoric. And then you have a speaker going, "Order! Order! Right. Mr. Gove." Oh. Right. Right? Right. So,
you were saying?
So
something about offensive language.
That's right. So under normal circumstances, one is not prohibited from expressing any particular idea or thesis in Parliament. However, one is constrained as to how one may express it. Now, there are, with some interesting exceptions. For example, one of the rules in British Parliament is that you're not allowed to accuse another member of lying, because it is beneath an elected representative to lie to the people.
I think that's a terrible rule.
Well, obviously that doesn't mean, right? Obviously that doesn't mean that we automatically assume that elected members of Parliament can't lie. That's ridiculous. However, what it does mean, functionally, is that the direct accusation of purposeful deception cannot be made during formal House sittings. It has to be expressed in a different way, and these constraints in Parliament create a kind of speech in Parliament, a formal political speech, where accusations of lying are expressed in a way like in a more muted way, where, you know, I do not think that the member for Stoke-on-Trent accurately represented the statistics, and I also think that they held back certain findings from this particular select committee and that particular select committee, and I desire the member for Stoke-on-Trent to answer for these discrepancies. I just called them a lying sack of shit, but I did it in a way that doesn't actually directly inhibit the progress of our debate.
Okay.
See?
Now, before we go any further, what if the idea that you're espousing can't be politely stated? What if you're Donald Trump, you're announcing your presidency, your candidacy, I should say, and your concern is that certain peoples from a certain country to your south are coming in and doing all manners of unspeakable acts, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, to be clear, I'm not defending Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm. No.
I'm not suggesting that Donald Trump has been anything but a disaster.
Yeah.
What I am suggesting...
Is there a more polite way to put it?
Well, I would suggest that his idea...
is so heinous it's impossible to put it in an acceptable fashion.
Well, why would you? Well, first of all, why would you if you're Donald Trump, right? You're basically running a counter campaign. And secondly, I'm trying to think out loud right now how you would even politely suggest it. Like just what I was saying to you before.
Yeah.
That there is a certain country with certain people coming in speaking unspeakable acts, right? Mm-hmm. The animating principle of his idea is the anger and the frustration and the sense of alienation.
Sure.
You don't express these things weighing your wording carefully, right?
Well,
the emotion is really the message, and how you get there is by talking about real or imagined issues on the border of the United States.
Well, first of all, on that first point there, I cannot disagree more wholeheartedly. In fact, if there's one place that I wanted to go see carefully orchestrated outrage, it would be the Houses of Parliament. So
now, hold on. Now that's what you want to see there. And again, I'm suggesting
what I'm saying is that the notion that one cannot express outrage in a way that conforms to these specific censorship constraints on rhetoric is it's just not the case.
Oh, it certainly makes it seem as though somebody like Donald Trump is immensely unimaginative.
Well, now one of the benefits to the parliamentary system, okay, although I should say forthwith that my favorite political commentators think very lowly of the quality of the members of Parliament in Canada and Britain. But one of the ostensive benefits of having a parliament is that in order to become a member and effectively conform to its traditions,
yes,
and its requirements, one needs some kind of experience and training.
So now, hold on. Explain that a little bit more, because if you're saying that somebody can't ever be a former.
No, that's not what I mean. What I mean to say is that, of course, and we would hope that our parliamentary democracies and our government is open to everyone, that it's not some sort of, that the political class is not limited to the rich, regardless of the facts of the matter. What we do want, though, and I think we would all agree, is we require for the good running of the country a standard of competence and a standard of an operating standard in our political discourse. And it is disastrous, and if the Trump administration has proved nothing, it has proved this. It is disastrous when that standard does not exist. Would you not agree?
Well, I would agree that the Trump presidency has certainly been a disaster for a number of reasons, not least of which being the shoot from the hip style in which he speaks, and the looseness with which he tends to the manners of presidential communication, okay? But I'm still not with you on this idea that there should be enforced legislative restraints on how leaders communicate. And for me, I think one of the biggest things has actually quite a bit to do with where people come from, and that I'm not necessarily thinking about this in strict geographic terms. This can also be in terms of their age. This can be in terms of their class and their education. Your political discourse needs to be open to the fact that people are going to come from different places and times and attitudes, and they're going to have different ways of speaking. That being said, I do agree that in Parliament or in Congress or wherever, the people functioning as elected representatives should speak with dignity and respect for each other. They shouldn't be lobbing ad hominem attacks at each other. There shouldn't be, a descent into utter, chaos as people make lewd accusations about each other. Right? I'm thinking, about any number of times that Donald Trump has picked a fight with somebody on Twitter or in an interview simply because they disagreed with him in public.
Right.
But not everybody's going to speak like an Oxbridge-educated member of the House of Lords. Okay, some people, and I'm trying not to hold them to a lower standard necessarily. I'm not suggesting that they should come into House of Parliament and drop F-bombs every other word. Okay, but if you, the way that people speak is oftentimes as potent as the ideas underneath them, and that may, and the way that they speak may be an expression of those ideas, may even be the idea.
So, can I give you a quick example of a purposeful flouting of parliamentary censorship laws for a reason? So, a famous example that just happened a while ago. This was just before David Cameron left government. So I guess it's only a year and a half ago. Anyways, and so David Cameron was still the Conservative Prime Minister in Britain, and there is a Labour member of Parliament named David Skinner. He's a famously free-worded Labour member within, of course, the confines of Parliament. And David Skinner,
I'm not familiar with him, if that's any indication.
Yeah, no, I'm just explaining for the those of you who might be listening. And anyways, David Skinner got up in Parliament and he accused David Cameron,
right,
of being dishonest.
Right.
And he called him at the end of his exhortation. He didn't say he was a liar, but at the end of his exhortation, he called him Dodgy Dave. Just a little of a catchy little gut shot.
That's very Trumpian in its own way.
Dodgy Dave.
Like Little Marco.
Yeah. And so the Speaker of the House, John Bercow, got up and he said, I must request that the member for whatever Skinner's constituency is, that David Skinner retract that word. And then Skinner goes, what word? And then the Speaker goes, you know the word beginning with D and ending with Y that you just used. Because... Right,
because the Speaker can't say it, or ought not to.
And it sounds a bit ridiculous, right? But this is
it almost sounds like a Monty Python sketch.
Almost, and it does have a level of comedy to it. That's true.
Of absurdity, yes.
But of course, the principle is. I think the principle is sound, right? It doesn't matter whether the word is dodgy, whether it's the F-bomb or whatever.
Well,
right?
yeah, this isn't a principle held just to the Houses of Parliament or the Senate. It's also one that you find in our courts of law.
Well, just before we leave
I can't tell.
No, you're right. I
can't tell the judge to go fuck himself. Right. I have to be very,
Right, or you ought not.
I ought not to.
There's penalties for that.
Right.
But so what happened was David Skinner refused to retract that statement.
Right.
And so the Speaker of the House was forced to expel him from the chamber for the remainder of that day's sitting.
Right.
So in this case, a Speaker in Parliament deliberately flouted the censorship laws on use of speech in Parliament in order to make a point, an impassioned point, and say that he was willing to be kicked out of the House, and therefore his constituency's voices robbed of that day's having a place in that day's affairs, for the sake of making the point that he really does believe that the Prime Minister was dodgy. The Prime Minister was disreputable, potentially lying, of course, is the implication.
Correct.
So, but I maintain that, and that's a great example of legislation of that kind of censorship legislation put into effect, because he's not, of course, ejected from the House permanently. He doesn't have his constituency called into question, but there is a real and immediate consequence for him using those words, and he couldn't just come into Parliament and do that every time. He would likely be ejected by his constituents if he did that, because then he wouldn't actually be functioning in Parliament. Because in order to function in the House, you have to abide by the rules. Now, my suggestion to put this, to expand these rules outside of the House, is a bit more radical, and I admit that that is a little more problematic, because if you can't swear inside the House, well, then where can you swear and curse, right? Can an elected member ever say anything bad in a public setting?
Can he, for example, go on a podcast?
Sure he could, and use terrible words, and he'll be pilloried in the media and whatnot. But he's not actually breaking house censorship rules. That's correct, and that is typically where that happens. So there's some flex there by nature, right?
Okay,
and that's fine. I'm not suggesting that that necessarily needs to be completely resolved. What I am suggesting is that, particularly in America's case, the lack of anything whatsoever, or at least so it appears, is so egregious that it's galvanized. It's helping galvanize the whole country, and inject that kind of inappropriate rhetoric into the speech of each and every person in the country, and is just by that act making political discourse as on the whole extremely difficult, effective political discourse. So this is why I'm saying.
Well, I mean, I guess my problem with that, first of all, I would still argue that you haven't necessarily contended with the notion that the way that you speak is the message, necessarily. What I would also contend is that there is a shifting, a free-floating idea of what is and is not acceptable that is constantly changing. And your legislation, proposed legislation, if you will, theoretical or hypothetical legislation, seems to suggest that these things aren't so free-floating, that they are more objective than not. But if we can imagine, for example, that there is a way that you can describe a certain group of people, class or by class or whatever designation, that is in one time utterly acceptable, right? In another time later on, maybe utterly unacceptable and may even be regarded as deeply offensive. And of course, we know of all sorts of terms that have simply fallen out on exactly this basis, even within the last 5 or 6 years. There's just certain ways that you could talk, or nobody would openly seriously take a stance against what you were saying, because it was just the accepted standard way of speaking, but no longer is, right? So when you make a legislation suggesting that there ought to be a strict code of, a strict guideline for how people speak, or particularly elected members speak in government offices, okay, you're kind of making the assumption that you know what's going to be offensive 10 years hence. And you simply don't. You have no way of knowing.
So my response to that would be that, of course, we're spitballing this whole thing, right? But okay, I haven't spoken about the nature of the legislation. That's a little more difficult. However, if you're forcing me to spitball, what I would suggest is...
Nobody is forcing you to spitball, Aaron.
What I would suggest is...
I don't have a gun or anything, and I'm not suggesting that, you have a conversation for the sake of, a podcast. It's not as if this is being recorded for its conversational abilities. None of these things are factors. We're just talking.
That's right.
Just ignore this metallic thing between us.
Is that a microphone? So I'm not proposing a law.
Right.
A singular law, because of course, as you say, it would likely be inflexible. What I would propose, though,
it's not simply that it would be inflexible. Quite the opposite. As I was stating
or
before,
excessively flexible.
It would be
sure.
It would be beyond
sure.
flexible and could impinge on anything you said. If I was to say to you that I don't think recycling ought to be a top priority of the municipal government.
Again,
we may yet find that people would say, but I worship planet Earth, and when you pollute, that is offensive to me on religious grounds.
Okay, well, again, it is not
offensive to you on religious grounds.
It is not content. It is rhetoric. That is the aim.
But I contend.
You're right. That's right. That the sometimes the method of speech is.
I contend.
Okay,
Aaron, that rhetoric and content need not be two separate concepts, and the way that you distinguish or that you express an idea may well be in and of itself the idea or an idea.
So I would think that if one was to expand the typical censorship laws found in parliaments to the broad sphere, to whenever a political figure is speaking formally, I would think that you would have some sort of elected tripartisan committee.
Wait a minute.
That could review any sort of situation and come to an agreement on the nature and the gravity of such situation. And for example, if just to speculate, if a situation or if a pattern of egregious, detrimental rhetoric can be seen and proved in a candidate or in a political figure, then it's possible that a penalty might be levied, such as a cut to the federal money available for their election campaigns.
Now, hold on, Aaron, right? Because,
or
again,
some such thing.
There's a lot to unpack in that statement, but first and foremost, I think another one of the problems that I have with this argument, generally speaking, is that it takes a very broad view of, not even a broad view, an unspecified view of what constitutes a political candidate or a political actor, right? Let me put it to you like this. Aaron, if I decide I was going to use this podcast as the launching point for my run for Senate as an independent candidate running on a platform of massive social reform. Okay? It may well be that all the F-bombs that I dropped in there in this episode thus far utterly disqualify me, right? But nobody even has to know about my candidacy. I could announce it to all my family and friends, and they are so disheartened by it that they choose not to tell anybody. Okay? So
here's the easy distinction. You are governed by the laws and expectations of a private person until you are no longer a private person. So what I'm proposing, for example, would not apply to Trump's campaign.
So is a private person always just those elected persons? Because
no,
so,
I mean a public person. Once the individual is elected, or and just because we're talking about Trump as an example, once the leadership race was over and he was the official candidate of the Republican Party, then he would be bound by these fantasy laws that I'm proposing, these constraints.
Yeah, I mean,
is that not reasonable?
No, because who will decide what is an official candidate? So presumably the political parties decides, but then there would have to be an intermediary body, right, between the parties to determine which of the parties then count as official parties that would be necessarily public. Does any of this make sense to you?
Well, of course it's going to depend. Well, I'm trying to outline
because
a broad principle.
Will this principle extend to a small communist party, let's say in Idaho or something that has only 500 votes?
Well, that's up for. I'm trying to describe the principle that's potentially applicable. I understand your question, but
do you understand the implications of that question? Because without deciding, first of all, you're
talking about the membership of the committee that determines.
Well, I mean, the infrastructure, the bureaucracy required to sustain this idea is itself troubling, because it's going to determine who is and isn't an official participant in our democratic experiment.
Well, I mean, we already have that bureaucracy working in a myriad of other ways. And either we distrust that bureaucracy entirely and seek to destroy it, or we direct its proper function. So I'm not advocating
to the leaders of that bureaucracy. I'm not seeking to destroy you.
Yeah, nor I. I'm simply suggesting that we expand its proper function.
And if you want to give me a job,
that's right. We expand its proper function to a place where it ought to be. And we have lots of bipartisan. In America, there's lots of bipartisan committees. In Canada, there's lots of multi-party committees to assess this, to assess that, to assess this, to assess that. There is no reason why there couldn't be another, elected committee.
But see,
to assess
even
political speech during a run of parliament.
But this
or whatever
potential bureaucracy
could be corrupted
by people who want to make sure that 500-person Communist Party in Idaho can't one day challenge their rule.
Well, what do you mean? Like, we're getting into super specifics really quickly here, right? You're forcing me to speculate more and more. Let's just say that
this is entirely speculative.
Yeah, I realize that. But okay, but to answer your question, let's just say that you're eligible as a political party in a Western country to sit on this committee if you hold at least one seat in Parliament, or you hold at least one seat in Congress.
Right.
Right. So there you go. Right. That solves most of our problems.
Okay.
Right? And I mean, more or less, that's how we take politics seriously these days now anyway. You don't actually get to, Lord Buckethead, who ran against Theresa May in her home constituency, was not taken seriously as a candidate. And no one would be extra stressed if Lord Buckethead dropped some F-bombs in his
Tuesday night podcast.
Yeah, or his what's a speech? His defeat speech.
Right.
Right. No one would care, but they would care what Theresa May said. They would care what Nigel Farage said. They would care what the leader of the current leader of UKIP said, whatever the hell his name is. They would care what I'm not sure if Britain First actually had a they care what Trump said. They would care what Clinton said. They would care what Trudeau said, what Jagmeet said, what Scheer said. That's what we're talking about. right? And this is the problem, because as I contain, the reason for this idea is that these national audiences that are guaranteed to these people are very vulnerable to their rhetoric. And the worst possible thing to happen is to have somebody who is uses extremely destructive rhetoric, Trump as an example, given this national audience, given an opportunity to continually inflict it upon the country in a way that cannot be stopped. And so I think with these modest mechanisms,
right,
using expectations which already exist, broadly speaking.
Well, okay, well, I guess that brings us to the next question. Mm-hmm. If they already exist, why legislate them? If they already exist informally, right? Because I'm still not convinced on this. I'm going to come back to this point again. You still haven't made a distinction between rhetoric and ideas, specifically with the idea being that rhetoric can be the idea.
Sure.
Okay.
So
hold on.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. But if we already understand that there's a social contract in place suggesting that, Aaron Bolorino can't stand up in his backbench seat and declare that Justin Trudeau is half squid, okay? I mean, you could. And
as long as you made a reasoned argument for it,
I'm sure. Yes, it doesn't need to be offensive. He could be half squid. I know plenty of good squids.
It's a matter for debate.
Yeah.
We've all seen SpongeBob.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I'm trying to say now is that we already have enough barriers in place for that kind of speech. Either barriers or consequences that would discourage you from speaking that way. Discourage you to the extent that you simply wouldn't speak that way.
See, I humbly submit to you that it ought to seem evident that we don't.
No, but no. Now hold on. Now
Trump could not happen if that were the case.
No. The reason why we're even having this discussion, the reason why so many people around the world are having this discussion, and why it's become a significant source of controversy in his presidency and before that his candidacy, is precisely because those standards exist and that he won in spite of them. So, if these standards did not exist and were not enforced, what he said and how he acts, there would be no controversy to it. But because these standards exist and are enforced, his continued usage of this rhetoric is precisely what fuels the debate.
So you're right, and I suppose perhaps the principal source of my frustration is the fact that there are no immediate consequences.
Now hold on. Now, just before I go any further, what I would say to that is that you're not the only person, of course.
No, of course not.
And I was making this point earlier with the media, but it's very, very important to remember that first of all, if we're going to use the case of Donald Trump, arguably there have been plenty of consequences thus far.
Well, insofar as his speech has affected things, yes, but that's
precisely the opposite. I would argue that Donald Trump. Now, I don't want to get too much into the specifics of this, right? Because we're just talking about the principle.
Trying to talk about the principle. That's right.
But a president or a leader, prime minister, whomever, who cannot speak reasonably, cannot expect to get much done. Because there would be so much resistance to what he is suggesting, or even amongst his allies, such a reticence to be seen with him, so long as the social contract remains intact, that his ability to functionally lead would be therefore limited severely. We're getting into the home stretch on this one now.
That's right.
We're going to be wrapping up soon.
I haven't convinced you yet, have I?
No, because back to that same point I keep harping on, oftentimes the rhetoric is the message.
So, okay, let me ask you this then.
So, just for people listening, the implications of this being that when you silence me from saying certain things, as awful as those things may be, nonetheless, you are silencing an idea, and by extension, silencing voters who, by voting for me, let's say, if I was the one speaking these nauseous ideas, you're therefore impinging their freedom of speech.
This will have to be my final argument. I'll have to make it brief.
Right.
If it's the case
that I've won this debate,
if it's the case that
I am victorious,
the art of rhetoric,
that I am a genius,
is the art.
No. Hold on. Now you see your wording here. I said rhetoric, not art of rhetoric.
No.
Rhetoric.
You let me make my argument, and you can rebuttal in whatever kind of inefficacious way you wish. If it's the case that the art of rhetoric,
okay,
is the method by which you communicate an idea.
That's not what I said.
I realize it's not what you said, but I'm speaking conceptually here, which I do believe that this is the case. Okay? This ought to be basically intuitive. Then we ought to understand that any one idea
Right.
can be expressed in a myriad of ways. A myriad of ways.
Okay.
No matter the desire
Okay.
of the person expressing it.
Right.
If I come home and see dishes on the counter and feel fundamentally in my core like swearing at my wife and telling her that she's done a terrible job with the dishes.
Now, hold on.
Not
listeners,
this is just hypothetical. Okay? and because she's listening, and I have to be very careful.
Listeners, he's not that awful.
Point being, if I felt that, regardless of why I felt that, if I felt that, it may very well be, objectively, that the truest expression of that feeling and of those ideas is to simply say them in the rawest way possible. That does not mean that it's impossible for me to express those ideas in a way that is more conducive to getting what I want.
Okay.
Hold
on.
So my last point is this. This is the last thing I'll say. It is not for me to prove that that rhetoric cannot be the idea. That rhetoric and content are separate. It is for you to prove that they are in fact, they can in fact be the same and indistinguishable, and that there are some things which cannot possibly be expressed in a variety of ways.
Okay. So this will be my final point here. We, by the way, promised that this episode would only go on 50 minutes, and we're at an hour and 2 minutes.
That's basically 50 minutes, give or take. You know.
That's basically 50 minutes. Okay. So, that little point aside, that little bit of inside baseball notwithstanding, to get to your point that you made earlier, that it is up to me to decide, to demonstrate or to prove that the expression, the vulgarity with which an idea is expressed is the idea. Can be the idea. That there cannot be any other.
That sometimes something
I would
can
argue
only be
that
said once.
I would argue no, that isn't something that I have to prove. In point of fact, I would go on to say that whether or not an idea can be expressed in less harsh terms is really immaterial, right? When Donald Trump set out on his misadventure into politics, he found himself very quickly representing a population who felt that they were so disenfranchised and so barred from constructive political conversation and effective political conversation that absent a rock through the window candidate like Donald Trump, no one would ever listen to them, that they would never be heard, that their ideas and their concerns would never be taken seriously. Ergo, when Donald Trump said those awful things about Mexicans, and other people. That was the idea. That was the idea. It was the rock through the window saying, look at me, pay attention to me. Nobody is paying attention to me. And for what Donald Trump was also saying was, I'm paying attention to you. I'm channeling your anger. That was the animating principle, going back to that phrase, of his candidacy and his campaign, was I am that voice. And of course, when he won the nomination of the Republican Party, offered to drain the swamp, his explanation was, because I'm the only one who can do it. So right from the get-go, the awful things that he said represented the idea. And you can't get around that. You can't get around that people felt so alienated by the political process and by the centrist policies of the Republican Party up to that point, that they weren't willing to take the action that that population felt was needed to resolve their problems. The anger is indistinguishable from the policy and the platforms that they put out. Because, as with all other human pursuits, you can't entirely separate emotion, for example, from idea. We don't operate like computers entirely. Sometimes if we're emotional, try as hard as we can to remain logical, try as hard as we can to remain rational and to engage in things as you and I are engaging in them, almost without weight or consequence, just two people talking about ideas. Nonetheless, our emotions and our frailty can creep in. And to say that they are entirely separate from the idea that such a candidate is espousing simply beggars belief.
Oh, I tried so hard. I'm the only one who thinks that nobody else that I've ever talked to agrees with me on this, man. Am I far out? Am I crazy? Is this some sort of like fascist free speech?
See, because we can actually come back to this in another episode, right? Because once we establish, let us assume for a moment that your idea goes over swimmingly with listeners. Okay, here's the next thing that you. What does punishment for this even look like? Are we just talking about being thrown out of your political party? Because if that's the case, who knows? If it's just being thrown out of your political party, or being primaried or something like that, well, these things already exist.
That's true, and in fact, America has a great system of constant a reselection where every sitting member is
right. I mean, arguably, this is what the Tea Party revolution in 2010 functionally was. People were not conservative voters. Hard conservative voters were deeply dissatisfied with the Republican Party as it currently stood.
Well, if you sorry.
And they were so dissatisfied with the content of their ideas and the way in which they expressed them, and demanded people who would express harder ideas with harder language, that they simply primaried or voted out these people and replaced them.
Which was, in fact, representative of the electorate. But if you recall what I mentioned earlier, rather cynically, I mentioned that one place we might motivate the good behavior of politicians is their pocketbook. And not necessarily their salaries, although I'm open to that, of course. But it's possible that given a consistent and flagrant and egregious flouting of the official rules of political discourse, that one's party's allotted electoral amount could be affected. And what that would mean is that a candidate representing a party is free to flout those laws whenever they wish, just like Dennis Skinner was free to flout those laws in Parliament. But there is an immediate consequence for a flagrant and unrepentant flouting of those laws. And if after every major ruling of this committee, this fanciful committee, that a major political party's electoral budget was slashed by 10 grand, 20 grand, 30 grand, and there were actual serious laws on electoral donations.
And you could somehow enforce all of this, get everybody to agree that they're going to enforce it. Which,
that's right.
In a politically divided time such as ours, in which there isn't even a properly
I don't think this would be likely to get to get in Parliament right now. But that's another matter. Call me fanciful idealist. That's another thing. I'm willing to accept that it's a fanciful idea. What I am trying to argue for is that in principle, at least, it's a useful and sound concept, and that even moving in that direction, I think, would be useful. Now, the details may vary, right? We're just talking quite broadly, conceptually here, but I do think it's possible to have in some at least limited degree, and especially in America, where it seems like there's no significant consequences or even constraints on official political discourse, the nature of it, rather. I definitely think they have to sort something out.
Well, on that note, we both agree that the political discourse has gotten quite out of hand.
Quite out of hand indeed.
It used to be that if you held fascistic beliefs, nobody would want to speak to you. And yet we live in a time and age where there are people, on the internet at least, expressing that quite openly and unabashedly.
Well, but not just in content, but also in rhetoric, which I still maintain is the more inflammatory thing. Because of course, now this is a much more cynical point. I don't think people engage in content very often. I think much more they engage in the veneer of the speech. They engage in the emotional shell around it. They don't actually engage at the core of it. And this is evidenced by people not taking seriously the incredibly heinous things that some politicians say, because they're hidden within a core of fanciful rhetoric, and also people overreacting to some things that politicians say, which are completely harmless and are blown out of proportion. There's no consistent application.
I remain unconvinced.
But I understand, so does everybody else. I'll continue to be lonely. And I'll have to, keep drinking tea with myself.
Smoking from your pipe.
That's right.
Like Sherlock Holmes.
Like Sherlock Holmes, alone, but for his faithful steed Watson, who solves the case.
Steed?
Yeah, Steed's face. That's what I think Sherlock Holmes thinks of Watson, like his steed.
Like a horse?
Not like a literal steed, but like a steed.
He doesn't think of him like a horse.
Like a knight and a steed, like a useful companion on the road to victory. But he's beneath him somehow. You see, like he's useful and he's brave.
No, Watson is his best friend.
Well, you can't be best friends with the horse.
You can't be best friends with the horse. The horse can't have. Hi, I'm Mike. The other guy's Aaron.
And you've been listening to Thought Fuzz.
If you like the show, tell your friends. If you didn't like the show, tell your enemies that you did. And don't forget to rate us wherever you heard this.
Follow us and continue the conversation on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Check out our show notes for all the links.
And finally, we'd like to say thank you to our listeners for supporting us. We couldn't do this without you.
Until next time, keep it fuzzy.